Good morning. I'm Brian Nelson, Vice President of Institutional Advancement at Dunwoody College of Technology. Welcome to our LEAD speaker series, and thank you for joining us this morning. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to remind you that all our attendees are in listen and view only mode, which means you will not be able to activate your webcam or microphone. You may use the chat feature to pose questions for the Q&A session after the presentation. This morning, it's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce R.T. Rybak. As a leader of one of the oldest and largest community foundations in the country, Rybak oversees the management of nearly $900 million in assets, the administration of more than 1,400 charitable funds created by individuals, families, and businesses, and the average annual distribution of more than $80 million in grants. A Minneapolis native, R.T. Rybak spent almost 30 years working in journalism, commercial real estate, and publishing before being elected mayor of Minneapolis from 2002 to 2013 in his first run for public office. Most recently, he served as executive director of Generation Next, a coalition of civic, business, and school leaders focused on closing the racial achievement gap in Minneapolis and St. Paul. He is the author of Pothole Confidential, about his 12 years as mayor of Minneapolis. He also serves as the chair of the Destination Medical Center Corporation, a 20-year public-private economic development initiative to facilitate and support public infrastructure in Rochester. He and his wife, Megan O'Hara, have 2 grown children. RT has a long history and connection to Dunwoody and will be a tremendous partner as we move forward in the future as an institution. RT will be giving a presentation on Career Paths Aren't One-Way Streets. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to RT.
Well, thanks very much. That was a great introduction. I sure appreciate it. And I'm coming to you live from Dunwoody. I'm sitting in this phenomenal conference room and I'm looking out at the snow and thinking this is a conference room I was in 10 years ago, maybe, when we sat with the leaders of Dunwoody and people who were looking at creating more industrial sewing employees in the community. And it was one of many, many examples of times when I've seen Dunwoody or actually been involved with Dunwoody in doing great things for our community. And so I'm really honored to be here today. You know, having said nice things about Dunwoody, you're going to be surprised what I'm about to say, but I'd like us for a minute to stop thinking about Dunwoody. Bear with me, guys. I'm not going to ruin this for you, but stop thinking about Dunwoody. In fact, I want you to stop thinking about pretty much everything, and I want you, probably since it's early, to actually shut your eyes for a second. And you're all by yourselves, and no one will know if we're all shutting your eyes, but I'm going to do that and encourage you to do that too. And there's a reason for this. What I want you to do is, with your eyes shut, to imagine that beautiful wind with that lovely snow is just blowing through your brain and it's taking everything out of your brain until your brain is now completely empty. And keeping your eyes shut as you push everything out of your brain, I want you to get a visual image of where you sit today, not just the chair or the couch you're on right now, but I want you to think about who you are right now, where you work, where you live, what you do every day, who you're with. And just with your eyes still closed, I want you to think about the first step that got you on the path to where you are right now. Can you see that first step? And I want you to think about who was there, who helped you, who gave you a boost. Maybe somebody was a teacher or a family member, maybe somebody you worked with. And as you open your eyes, I want you to just stop and assess what got you there. There's a path you took. It did not probably go in a straight line. None of ours do. And I want you to now think a little bit about what that will be like in a year, 2, 5, 10, 20, 100. And think about how different that path is going to be. And so we sit here today with an incredible institution that's been about pathways for young people and mid-career people and those at the end of their careers. But we have to stop and think about everything that's changing and recognize those paths are going to be different. How are we going to be that person who you saw entering your life at that first step? I'm going to take just a couple minutes to talk about my path, not because you need to hear about it, but because it's an example as I go through mine that I hope you'll be going through yours a little bit too, to help us remember the different ways that these paths can go. And I want to bring in some of the experiences I've had that I think will talk to us a little bit about where paths may be going and how we can help the next generation. So in my own case, when I close my eyes, I think pretty quickly about my mother. My father died when I was a kid. My mother, her dream was always to go to college, but she'd gotten married young and had kids and hadn't been able to. So her kids were going to go to college. So when my father died, she got a job working at an administrative job at a city or at a school as a secretary, and worked her way up and eventually became the college guidance counselor at a high school. She put herself through college. She then put us through college. And I think about my mom a lot because getting on that path for her meant getting to college and getting your kids on the way. I had a huge privilege having my mother, but there was one problem. And the one problem was actually me, that I was a terrible student. I was distracted and disconnected and probably pretty disrespectful of the teachers. And I was given another chance, and a third and a fourth and a fifth. And probably because my mother worked at the school, I was able to stay in the school in spite of the fact that I was getting terrible grades and I was a behavior problem in the school. Somehow managed to get out of high school and got into college, and suddenly everything changed. That first day at school, when I got that big course book about all the options I had, my brain exploded. And suddenly I realized that if I took charge of my own path and stopped looking at everyone else's path and rejecting it, things would be very different. And they were. I was a very good college student, and I went on to do many other things. And I've reflected back on that, especially in these later years as I've done so much work on education equity. And I thought about some of those words that were connected to me on every report card or in every conference where I was called in and they were yelling at me: disrespectful, disconnected, disengaged. Just imagine if the exact same story was told and there was only one factor that was changed. And that factor was that I was Black. A young Black boy who's disengaged, disrespectful, disconnected in school. I recognized pretty quickly that I would not be here today if that one factor of my race had changed. And that's one of the reasons why my body of work is so strongly focused right now on education equity and recognizing that we have let way too much time go by without addressing the core issues behind that. As my path went forward, I did a bunch of different things. I was a reporter for the Star Tribune. I was development director of the downtown council. I was in commercial real estate, so I could work on downtown planning, which I love. Publisher of the Twin Cities Reader. I got a job as a vice president of an internet company. I hadn't been on the internet at the time. That was kind of fascinating. Did a bunch of work, became the mayor, led this nonprofit on education equity, Generation Next, and now I'm at the Minneapolis Foundation. When I close my eyes and think about that path, I never could have predicted that. And I would love to not repeat it because I could never repeat the same steps. But what's also become clear during that is that my passion for pathways is now the life work that I have. And it really sunk into me when I began doing something that was deeply meaningful to me. About my third year in office, I began going to every single high school in Minneapolis every year and doing an assembly with every single ninth grade. And in that assembly, I'd ask them to close their eyes, and I asked them to empty their brain out and imagine the one thing they want to do. And imagine they were the very best at it. And then imagine one adult, one trusted adult who'd help them get there. And I worked with them, and then I asked them a little bit about what do they want to do. And so over many years, every single high school, every ninth grade, I saw thousands of kids in our schools, and I heard them talk about what they wanted to do. And it was an overwhelmingly inspirational experience for me. But the most inspirational part is that I saw the future and I saw the workforce that we're developing. And I recognized the fact that the young people sitting in those seats were so different than I was. And I'd ask them a couple of questions. I tell them they're the most valuable generation we've ever raised. And then they'd kind of look at me skeptically like ninth graders do. And I said, okay, I'll prove it to you. How many of you speak a language other than English? 2 or more? 3 or more hands are going up across from 4 more. 5 or more languages, a few hands would go up. How many of you were born in a foreign country? Hands go up. But then the really key question I'd ask was, how many of you can look around this room and see someone different than you? And of course they'd laugh because the room was so incredibly diverse. And I told them that when I asked those questions in my high school, none of those hands would have gone up. And I saw that what we're raising is this unbelievably culturally fluent generation that has extraordinary capacity to cross boundaries. We have used the discussion about diversity to talk about the deficits of an increasingly diverse population, when the fact of the matter is we are sitting on a multicultural gold mine. And if we are smart and invest both our time and our energy and our moral support, we are going to be able to do extraordinary things. Stop and think about what skill sets we need in this next generation. Creativity, cultural fluency, the ability to be put in a situation with people different than you. These are far more important than they have ever been. And they are exactly the skill sets we are incubating in these hothouses that we see as our high schools right now. And that is disproportionately true where there's disproportionate diversity. I've spoken to high schools of primarily white students in suburban and far suburban areas, and I talked to them about the achievement gap. And when I talk about the achievement gap, they automatically thought about students in highly diverse schools that are said that they have this big achievement gap. But I said, what you really have is you have an opportunity gap to these primarily white students. You have not had the opportunity to be in as diverse settings as these kids in, say, Minneapolis public schools are. And so when you walk into an increasingly diverse workplace, you will be at a disadvantage. You have to intentionally seek out situations that come very naturally to kids who are going to schools in very diverse settings. And that's why we have to turn this issue of diversity on its head. So how have we done that? Well, to me, the most meaningful body of work I've ever had really began in 2003 when we realized we were going to have a bad summer for summer employment. We didn't realize some of the summers that were going to come after that. So we scrambled around and got a few summer jobs. And one of my partners on that was a guy named Richard Davis, who was the CEO of US Bank. And after the summer ended, I said, oh, this was fun. Let's go do 2,000 next year. And he said, wrong. What we've got to do is set up a system to make this work so every job is a quality job and get mentors in. And Richard really coached me through that. And we launched the Step Up Summer Job Program. Today, we have now put more than 20,000 young people, 86% kids of color, through high quality summer jobs. That also led me to be partners in creating something called Urban Scholars, which took college students and created the same sort of experience. And now I'm working on a program called Connect MSP. Connect MSP is an alumni association for graduates of Step Up and the other high performing programs like the Power Review, College Possible, and others. And it's now at Greater MSP, the business association, so that we can connect these alums with HR departments in some of our bigger companies. We're creating that pipeline. As we look at that, though, we have to really stop and think about how are we really rethinking the pathways? And that's what Dunwoody is very much about, and why I'm so incredibly excited that Dunwoody has always been very focused on kids in need, but is especially focused right now. And to those of you listening who've been partners with Dunwoody on that, the idea of reaching out and creating these pathways intentionally for those kids who we have labeled as being a deficit to our society, when they are in fact the future of our society. Thank you. Thank you for being part of that. And what we need to do too is to recognize there are a number of trends that are happening. And I want to talk about these more in the Q&A because I want to open this up for us all to talk in a second. But one of the ones that we really need to think about is this idea that the idea of high school is really changing, and college to a certain degree too, and any post-secondary. The walls are coming off all of these different places. Stop and ask yourself, do we really need to have every kid from 9th to 12th grade sitting within 4 walls in one institution taking classes in this traditional way, or should we be connecting them far more quickly to outside experiences? Step Up is an example of that sort of on-hands learning, but there is much more that should be done. I have to say, sitting right here, looking at Dunwoody, looking at MCTC over there, and looking in that direction and knowing full well that there is a strategy now to develop a new North High School into a magnet that will attract kids from throughout the city. There is a big idea here between connecting these institutions that says that a student should be able to navigate between the experiences at Dunwoody, the experience at MCTC, the experience at North High, and have their degree taking place. And the irony of all of this is that we've said that these programs that allow high school kids to take college classes should be reserved for the highest achieving students. The research shows that sometimes it's those students who are not performing as well who benefit the most. And I speak to you from personal experience on that. So what I want to do is there's much more I want to talk about, but really I know I've got a smart audience here. So I want to stop and just have us have a give and take about some of the questions. So I wonder if team with me here, we can ask people to submit questions in the chat, and I will take off from there.
So RT, can you talk a little bit where you see the vision of how the Minneapolis Foundation will be playing into that, and where you see that organization supporting the community efforts and et cetera?
Absolutely. I am not the CEO of a foundation where I have control of all the money. That's not what the Minneapolis Foundation is. There are foundations like that, McKnight, Bush, and others. The Minneapolis Foundation is one of the oldest community foundations in the country. And what that means is, while we have about $7 million a year that we grant out, and education is one of our 2 areas, and we're deeply engaged in those issues, the primary place that dollars come through the foundation is that individuals open up their own donor funds there. And we have doubled the amount of money that comes through that just in the past 5 years. Donors used to put in about $40 million to those accounts and bring out about $40 million. That's a lot. But now this past year, I think we put out $83 million into the community, and we are in the process of bringing in more than $100 million to reseed those funds. Those donors go all over the map. So we're trying to do more to create a community of generosity, meaning 1,800 people putting out $80 million a year, all with their different viewpoints. We want to bring together around bigger issues so that they can align. And so, for instance, one effort we're very excited about is called Reimagine Education. And what that is it's recognizing that some of these things that I talked about and that we're working on that are happening out in the community are not really being done as well as they need to, because everybody's got a different idea. So we're trying to rebuild the coalition around education improvement and reform. So we took a body of work where every metropolitan superintendent played out what they would do to address education equity. We then created a convening of 1,500 youth of color to put their viewpoint on it. We then brought a research team in from the University of Minnesota to vet those ideas. They came back in when COVID happened to look at that within the lens of distance learning. We then did a convening of school boards across the state to build onto that. Governor Walz saw this, asked us to be part of funding a roundtable that advised his education policy, which just came out. So if you go on our website, or if you just Googled Reimagine Education Minneapolis Foundation, you'd find a body of work that's going to continue to grow. And that's part of what we're trying to bring not only to our donors, but to others to begin to make change.
Perfect. How do you see, RT, how do you see the combination of public, private, government, education, all those pieces coming together that may or may not have worked in the past? How do you see that changing over the next several years?
You know, that's such a good question, because sitting in the chair of philanthropy, um, what I think happened in recent years is a lot of philanthropic dollars went to disruptive parts of education to really change the system, and I think that makes sense. But the fact of the matter is, you can't philanthropy away change public systems. You know, having been in both the public and the philanthropic worlds, I have this saying that government is a gas station, philanthropy is Jiffy Lube. What I mean by that is government is what we do every day. Jiffy Lube, meaning philanthropy, is where you go every once in a while to make it work better. The gas station, the place you go every day, the public realm, means public schools, and that changing those means you've got to get involved in issues of governance, school board elections, what the governor's funding strategy is, policy discussions like one that just took place in Minneapolis about changing boundaries. And so it's going to take a partnership. We in philanthropy helped fund, for instance, the On Track program in Minneapolis schools to help track in ninth grade when kids get off track and how you do interventions. But we only did that with the guarantee that the district would pick up the cost of that so we can redeploy the dollars elsewhere. I think what you guys are talking about at Dunwoody, and especially this idea of creating resources that will help kids who would financially not otherwise be able to go here, is central to what I think philanthropy should be engaged in.
Great. What do you see as the cause of the lack of education equity, and what can be done to bridge that gap and to build that sort of that continuum of education that needs to happen?
You know, it's not a simple answer, and I just finished, as I say, this roundtable with people from around the state looking at that and issuing all sorts of reports and such. But I think part of it is recognizing a couple of very significant truths. One is that we are taking a system that was developed for one culture and trying to figure out a way that we can gerrymander it to somehow accommodate kids from multiple cultures. We have a single culture education system for a multicultural world, and it's not working. And that starts with the idea of what the curriculum is and its relevance. We have to start with that, obviously, with what we're taught in history and other coursework, but we also have to deal with the issue that as culturally diverse as teachers can be, and there are many, many examples of teachers of a majority teacher culture teaching kids of many different cultures. The fact of the matter is, a black kid can go to kindergarten in Minneapolis and go all the way through that school district. And when I say Minneapolis, I'm saying any school in this state can go all the way through that school and maybe not ever see a person who looks like them in the front of their classroom. That should shock us, and it should force us to do significant change, which is why one of the reasons why the diversity of diversifying the teaching corps is one of the big issues that we're working on. We also have to recognize that that while it's extremely important to measure the progress of students, we also have to recognize there are metrics that we have not been using that will tell us much more. For instance, math, science, I happen to believe that we do need to measure so the kids don't fall through the crack. But there's some really groundbreaking research by Dr. Michael Rodriguez at the University of Minnesota that built in social and emotional development into that too. And these were the first graphs I really saw that turned achievement gaps and opportunity gaps on their head. Unfortunately, I was used to looking at so many graphs where there were white kids and then kids of color behind. Once you build in social and emotional metrics, the whole thing shuffles. For instance, if you take a measure like commitment to learning, which is like it sounds, how committed are these kids to learning? White kids are about in the middle, and above them are African American, Hmong, Asian, and Somali kids. So when was the last time, really honestly, you heard a group of white parents get together and say, I want my kid in a classroom with kids more committed to learning, find more African American, Hmong, Asian, and Somali kids? Well, that is what the data show. Unfortunately, if you then take another data point, which is positive identity, almost all those groups plunge. So you begin to get a picture of saying that the issue of positive identity and seeing yourself within a learning community and seeing your history reflected and seeing a person in the front of that classroom who reflects you is critically important. It paints a picture of an African-American kid in a math class, and the teacher should spend less time saying work harder because they're probably more committed than their white counterpart to that learning, but more time on I believe in you. So that's the sort of insight that I think we have to do to really, really rethink how we're teaching and what we value.
Great, and that RT, at the end of this pipeline of education are industry partners and businesses. How do you envision businesses, what their role is in this effort to move this continuum along and get students through the pipeline? How do you see that businesses connecting in on that?
You know, one of the reasons Dunwoody is such a great institution is because business has always been at the table in a partnership on what product, if you will, is being produced. The entire history of Dunwoody, as I understand it, has been crafted with employers at the table, and that has really helped determine what you're taught in the class. That is not the case with most K-12 education. One of the reasons I was so proud of the work that we did at Step Up, it was really the most significant effort we've ever had to connect the student to the workforce, but we need a much tighter feedback loop with that happening in the curriculum being taught in the class. You know, I mean, let's unpack math for a second. You know, learned algebra and geometry, and they were very important, and I kind of wanted to be an architect, and they would have been helpful in that and a few other things, but I really haven't used that often in my life. However, sure wish I would have been taught how to read a spreadsheet. Sure wish I would have been able to figure out in high school some of the things that I needed when I went into commercial real estate and I had to negotiate leases. Sure wish I would have had deeper understanding of personal finance in high school. And when you walk that through different careers, and let's not just pick on math, pick on any of these factors, that feedback loop that is so close and so tight here at Dunwoody is not replicated in our K-12 or our college experiences. That has to change.
Good, thank you for that. As you work with the Minneapolis Foundation and working with the various funders that you know in the community, what are they most concerned about for the future of Minnesota? What's the word on the street that you hear from the financial supporters in the philanthropic community?
You know, when I began working on education equity 15 years ago in different ways, I was stunned by, as the scales came off my eyes, as I recognized the gaps, as I recognized privilege within that system and lack of it and all of that, I was really outraged at the passivity our community has about what it would accept. The fact that we would not be demanding change at a much more aggressive level deeply, deeply disappointed me, if that's even the right word. A community I'm so proud of should be ashamed of itself for having the kind of gaps that we have. And the good news over time, if I can call it that, is that there's been a much deeper appreciation of these gaps. I have been moved and impressed by how this community, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, has woken up on a much deeper level to the inequities in our community. Many people who I felt were on the sidelines and intentionally clueless about this have gotten off the sidelines, and I think that's real progress. But ask yourself who ran for the school board last time. Ask yourself what was the biggest issue on the last school board agenda. I bet your answer would be probably not as deeply informed as it needs to be. That's not just about you, it's this whole community. It's what we cover in the media, it's what we talk about with our friends, it's what we choose to research, and we've dropped the ball. The grown-ups are letting kids down, and we've got to look in the mirror and do a lot better.
Good, thank you. How do you see the collaboration between various nonprofit organizations that have different inroads and different paths, but cross over on the same markets, the same students, the same clients, that type of thing? How do you see the importance of that moving forward? It's trying to address these issues.
Well, you know, having just said I'm ashamed of our community, can I say something? I'm incredibly proud of the community in that we have supported an incredibly robust out-of-school network. And I could start naming names, but the problem is I'd leave a bunch of people off. We have such a great ecosystem. We need to do a better job of connecting the external partners up with the education partners especially. And there is a great opportunity staring us in the face right now. It's an opportunity that comes from a rolling disaster, and the rolling disaster is what has happened with our kids learning during this period of distance learning and COVID isolation and everything else. We have a huge challenge facing us, and this is the time to unite those systems. What I'd love to see is an all-out drive this summer, everybody out of the bleachers and onto the field right now, and figure out a way that we can surround these young people in the summer to help catch up to what has been lost. One of the things we know is that simply more hours in a classroom doesn't help that much. There is a maximum load of what a kid can take sitting in a classroom. And let's face it, that load is a lot tougher when you're doing it on a computer screen day after day after day after day. So we got to think differently. So think about this summer and think about all of these summer enrichment programs that we have. How do every one of us figure out some way to be part of a learning experience for young people? And I think that means not only an enrichment program, but to actually work with school districts to do specific credit recovery. We funded some work 2 summers ago that I was really excited about to hopefully pioneer this work, where we took kids who were behind in credits in 9th grade, and then built into a summer program. Wolf Ridge was one, Wilderness Inquiry was another, summer enrichment program, actual credit recovery. Instead of the kid just going to a great program that taught them the science within nature, do all of that, but also work with the district to get credit recovery. So the kid who flunks science in 9th grade and then goes to this phenomenal summer enrichment program where suddenly they see science in the trees and the forests that they're in, actually recovers that credit. So when they start 10th grade, they can actually take 10th grade science instead of repeat 9th grade science, and all their enthusiasm goes away. There are lots of ways I think we can tie together, but let's talk about this summer.
When you look at, again, that continuum, what do you see as the most critical age for career pathways for exposing students, and how do we get the parents tied into that? Where's that critical pivot point for students to say, this is where career is going to make a difference and this is where I should head?
Yeah, well, everything we know is that everything starts really, really early, and there's some great research coming out of the University of Minnesota that's giving us how early, and it's sort of shocking how many things are determined incredibly early. Early childhood is the most important time for any young person. It's a time when so many things are established. It's critically important. Period. Stop. Breath. Now, I will say that I've spent most of my career outside of that area, not because I think other areas are more important. Early childhood is the most important. But I think in this community, we tend to think early childhood is so important that if we get that right, we can just let our kids, wander around later on. So I've focused mostly, exclusively on the 9th grade up through post-secondary. That's been where I've chosen to focus. If I could say, in part because there was a gap there that needed to be connected, and in part it was bluntly from my own personal experience, I realized where I went off track and where I needed to get back on, and it was in that zone. I think if I could really say, on careers, I would probably start about fourth or fifth grade and into the 10th grade window of establishing where a kid wants to be and then moving beyond that. And when I say what a kid wants to be, what I left out of my story was when I was 13, I decided I wanted to be mayor of Minneapolis. And when I was 17, I decided I wanted to also be a journalist. And I went to college with that strategy, and I came back and I did that. I was very, very planful about that. Not every kid can be planful, and not every kid should determine where they want to be when they're in fourth grade or sixth grade or ninth grade or whatever. And one of the things that I have always counseled students on is cross-train your brain, because you don't know what you're going to need to know. An example is, in the middle of my career, as I mentioned earlier, I got a job as vice president of an internet company. Well, the internet was brand new. I had not been on the internet before I took the job, and so I had to walk into a group of highly skilled engineers, and I was the idiot who hadn't been on the internet yet. That required me to have my brain be a lot more flexible than I was ever trained to be. That job was obviously not invented when I was in high school, and God only knows what jobs are going to be out there for these kids now. So when I say determine a path, I think really we should be saying more, I should be saying more, develop a skill set and develop some visions on how you're going to get to some places. So I guess the short answer is I think that fourth grade up to about 10th is probably the place I would focus the most. I've focused the most on 9th through post-secondary.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Artie. We've got time for one more question. Just want to throw out the idea: if you had a magic wand and you could cast it on the Twin Cities market, what would you see? What would you want to happen? What would be that focus? What would be that change in the community that they could right the ship and bring things back to where your vision takes it?
Can I do a couple?
You can. You're the speaker. You can have as many as you want. So.
Well, the first thing is I wouldn't say that a child's education should determine on whether they happen to live in a community that has more office buildings or shopping centers. We use the property tax to pick winners and losers with kids. I would metropolitanize school funding, and I'd increase it, but I would certainly level it off so that we don't have some schools that have extraordinary resources and some not. I would put a premium on teachers' cultural fluency, and I would create a Marshall Plan for bringing waves of new teachers of color into the system, starting with this summer with a program that takes a step-up-like approach to take 9th and 10th graders and have them teaching 4th and 5th graders this summer and fund it at a level that we could get it to scale, and then create the protections for those teachers so that they wouldn't walk into to systems with seniority that had the teachers of color be the first ones to lose. I would rebuild curriculum around much more relevant and culturally fluent, asset-based way of looking at the world and looking at a multicultural world. I would put a dramatically higher value on language, and I would create a program for kids who know another language or 2 or 3 or 4 to be trained as teachers so they could teach us adults the languages and the cultural fluency that we need, and I'd bring that into every park in the city. I'd keep the enrichment programs, football teams, bands, others, but merge them with the park system, because we have parks everywhere. And where a kid goes to school shouldn't determine which football or baseball team they're on. If we could do a much better job fielding many more teams. Want some more? And the other thing I do is I wouldn't ask that question to be determined by somebody who's never had an education degree like me. I'm not an educator. I'm a guy who loves the city and who sees the future as something that is incredibly bright and incredibly culturally fluent, and I want us to be the grown-ups who make it a lot better for kids.
RT, super. Thank you for your time this morning and your insights. And I'm so great to hear your message and to hear your passion about the community and your passion around education and bringing all these partnerships together. You've been a great partner for Dunwoody and look forward to working with you in the future as we move things forward here and look forward to further interactions. I want to thank the audience.
I love every school, but I really love Dunwoody. So keep doing great work.
Super. Thank you for that, RT. I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. Our next LEAD presentation is Thursday, March 4th. Hutch Coburn, Senior Vice President of PROMAC, a national leader in manufacturing, will be our guest. Should be an exciting and entertaining presentation as well. Again, thank you, RT, for being here with us this morning. It won't be the last time you'll be back on campus. We'll look forward to seeing you again soon. I want to wish everybody a wonderful day. Please be safe and drive carefully if you have to go somewhere today with the snow. And thank you for being part of our LEAD speaker series. Have a great day.
Okay, there you go.